Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Michel Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. So this is probably one of the best known books of critical theory out there. It's an incredibly influential book, largely because this is where Foucault introduces his idea of panopticism, which is a really important philosophical concept. So what Foucault did, basically, what Foucault did, what his critical methodology largely was, this is a very, very superficial gloss of it, is histories of power, essentially. So Foucault believed that social structures, whether that was prison, whether that was medical clinics, whether that was sexuality, whether that was whatever it was, all of these things are constructed in ways that exert power in different ways over individual subjects. And that can be traced historically. There's a sort of genealogy or evolution of these types of power. And so in Discipline and Punish, he moves from the first portion, which is about, it's called Torture, Part 1, through Punishment in Part 2, Discipline in Part 3, and then Prison in Part 4. And so basically he traces this sort of development over time. The book starts, somewhat as it means to go on, with a lengthy 3-page description of a botched public execution in 1757. And essentially the interesting element that Foucault starts from is that in the earliest phases of crime, justice, discipline, punishment, the role of justice, the role of the penalty as such is for the monarch to basically engage in a symbolic battle with the condemned and then defeat them at the end. This is why you have public execution, public torture, public rituals of the condemned confessing their crimes, begging for forgiveness, etc., etc. All of this was about the public nature of the crime and of the penalty, especially. But in the 1700s, into the 1800s, Foucault identifies a shift that occurs. So what he says here is, on the other hand, crime, the object with which penal practice is concerned, has profoundly altered. The quality, the nature, in a sense, the substance of which the punishable element is made, rather than its formal definition. Under cover of the relative stability of the law, a mass of subtle and rapid changes has occurred. Certainly the crimes and offenses on which judgment is based are juridical objects defined by the code, but judgment is also passed on the passions, instincts, anomalies, infirmities, maladjustments, effects of environment or heredity, acts of aggression or punish, so also through them is aggressivity. Rape, but at the same time perversions, murders, but also drives and desires. But it will be objected, judgment is not actually being passed on them. If they are referred to at all, it is to explain the actions in question and to determine to what extent the subject's will was involved in the crime. It goes on like this for a little bit. But the gist here is that you have a shift from what we might call the medieval or feudal model of punishment, in which it was, this is the crime, this is the guilty person, therefore penalty, to this is the crime, we now need to know the guilty person. We need to know the accused. We need to know their psychology, their mindset, their background. We need to know their environmental conditions. We need to understand why they did the thing that they did, or are accused of doing, whatever it is. We need to understand this person. It's no longer simply an equation in which you have a crime, you have the guilty person, therefore penalty. It is, we have the crime, now we need to put the accused under the microscope. This is what Foucault would call biopolitics, in a way. This is about the control of life through the means of power. The investigation is not an investigation of the crime, or not entirely an investigation of the crime. It is an investigation of the crime, but also an investigation of the criminal. We need to know the criminal thoroughly. And so this becomes an important component of jurisprudence, getting to understand the criminal as such. And this involves much more intrusive, much more substantive, much more surveillance-driven approaches to justice. So we have that as the sort of first transition. And one of the things that ends up aligning with, and to a certain degree these are related, but they're sort of really parallel developments. You also have the emergence of disciplinarity, social discipline. And Foucault talks about this as well, that really in the 18th century, and especially the 19th century, people's lives become much more regimented, much more regulated. And part of this comes from, part of this sort of expands outward from military activity, because in military activity, especially once you get to the use of something like muskets, of firearms, it's much more important to have everybody sort of drilled properly, right? Everybody in that line, in that battle line, needs to move at the same time so that the weapons are effective, because you're depending on this sort of mass volley fire and things like this. And so you have these very regimented military training procedures. And we still have this today, right? The way that you stand, the way that you walk, the position of your hands, the way that you hold your head, the way that you hold your weapon, the way that you move your weapon from one position to another. All of this stuff is very, very, very detailed and very regimented. But this also expands outward, Foucault argues. So we see this in schools, where there is much more sort of hierarchical control, much more regimented control over people's time, over people's behavior, over where their focus is. We see this with the rise of industrialism. In factories especially have very, very regimented time schedules, etc., etc. And so you have this social, and Foucault argues that we see this with medicine as well. Hospitals become much more regimented. And so things like the breakup of time, things like the separation of activity into individual steps, very small scale steps, standardization of testing or exams, and then sort of having hallmarks at different levels of competence. these become the things that are really important in terms of social disciplining, in terms of training people within a particular society to behave the way that the structures of power require them to behave. So you've got that. These two things merge. This increase in social discipline and the move to a more human and psychologically centered jurisprudence. These two things merge, and you get a transition in social observation, right? In the creation of social hierarchies in order to disseminate power while still centralizing authority. Again, something like a factory is a really, really good example of this. And Foucault talks about the importance of hierarchical power structures within modern life, within modern panoptic life especially. A factory is a really good example of this because you will have central management, the CEO or whoever it is, the owner of the company, but then they have sort of top executives who are responsible for different elements. Below them is middle management. Below them might be floor supervisors, and then the great mass of workers themselves, who are the subject of observation, but do not necessarily get to observe those who are observing them. They probably get to observe their foremen and things like this. They may get to observe their floor manager, whatever it is, but they don't get to observe the executives, right? But because there is that hierarchical structure, you have a layer of foremen who report to floor managers who report to middle managers who report to executives who report to the owner, the CEO, whatever it is. Authority, knowledge, and information is still centralized, right? The CEO, the executive, whoever it is, has that knowledge. It is centralized with them, but the network of observation is diffuse, right? Different people at different levels, each functioning to filter information upwards and authority downwards. And so when we get to the idea of panopticism, this is actually originally inspired by a prison created by Jeremy Bentham called the Panopticon, which basically, the Panopticon was sort of a circular or maybe octagonal prison, something like that, with cells facing inward into an open courtyard. So cells faced inward, the walls, the side walls, the back wall of the cell, basically sealed. In the back wall, to the outside, there was a small window, but the front into the courtyard was open. And the reason for that is there was an observation tower in the center. From within the observation tower, which would be shielded with Venetian blinds, is what Bentham imagined, prison guards could look into every cell at any given moment, right? And so the thing that's really interesting, the thing that Foucault picks up as super important is that if at any moment a prisoner can be observed, but they don't know that they're being observed, they have to, at every moment, behave as though they are being observed. Right? So basically, what Foucault argues is that the structure of the panopticon actually trains the observed subject, trains, in this case, the prisoners, to always behave as though they are under scrutiny. They internalize the structures of power to the point where you actually necessarily don't even need guards at all. It is sufficient that every prisoner knows at every moment that they could be observed, and therefore they must behave as though they are being observed. This is the real big insight of panopticism. So, as Foucault sort of characterizes the prisoner in the Panopticon, he is seen, but he does not see. He is the object of information, never a subject in communication. But the thing that's important about this, again, is the internalization of power. This is really the thing that matters, and that Foucault argues is the sort of dominant psychological mode of the modern world. So he says here, hence the major effect of the Panopticon, to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power, so to arrange things that the surveillance is permanent in its effects, even if it is discontinuous in its action, that the perfection of power should tend to render its actual exercise unnecessary, that this architectural apparatus should be a machine for creating and sustaining a power relation independent of the person who exercises it. In short, that the inmates should be caught up in a power situation of which they themselves are the bearers. And then a little bit later, he explains this in terms of panoptic consciousness. So he says here, he who is subject to a field of visibility and who knows it assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. He inscribes in himself the power relation in which he simultaneously plays both roles. He becomes the principle of his own subjection. And this is really important, right? What Foucault argues and what the premise of Bentham's Panopticon is that when you are observed, you have to behave as though you're being observed. And when you think that you're being observed, especially if you aren't sure, you have to always behave as though you're being observed. And so you discipline your own activity. You discipline yourself. You limit what you are doing to avoid being punished. And this is really important because Foucault says this is not just about how prisons work, or how schools work, or how hospitals work, or how factories work, or any of these other, or the military, how any of these sort of social institutions work. This is also fundamental to the way that we experience ourselves in the world today. So what he says here is, the Panopticon, on the other hand, must be understood as a generalizable model of functioning, a way of defining power relations in terms of the everyday life of men. And this is, I think, very, very true, especially, this was written in, I want to say 1977. Okay. 77 this comes out. More so true today in the digital age, after the digital revolution, right? I have my phone with me almost all the time. That is very much the norm nowadays. My phone has GPS. I can be tracked wherever I go based on my phone. Every time I buy something online, every time I post something to YouTube, every time I post something to other social media, every time I visit a website, I can be tracked, and I am tracked, in fact. Mostly by corporations, but also in some cases we know by the U.S. government. Just Edward Snowden very much revealed this to us back in the day. All online life is documented. We are constantly subject to surveillance. But even if you don't have a cell phone, even if you aren't online, which almost no one is in 2024, it's virtually impossible to live in modern society without a cell phone and without being online. Some people still do it. But you are still likely subject to surveillance because, especially in the West, we have massive numbers of surveillance cameras. We have security cameras in individual stores. We have public CCTV systems in public areas, etc., etc. We are constantly being observed, constantly being scrutinized. And so one of the things that Foucault would argue, I think, is that contemporary behavior is shaped by and rooted in that awareness of constantly being surveilled. That we today fundamentally experience the world differently than, say, our medieval or ancient ancestors did, who, if you were observed, it was because there was a direct observer there. We experience the world in a very different way, and we police our own behavior in many ways because of that consciousness of being observed or potentially being observed.